Hello, Croeso, and welcome to the first psychology session with e-sgol. Today, I am going to talk you through what the plan is for the next few weeks, and then we are going to start looking at drug therapy and dream analysis. The sessions are going to go according to what is on this slide now for you. So session 1 today, we're going to look at drug therapy and dream analysis, and they are the biological and psychodynamic therapies. After that, we're going to look at CBT and systematic desensitization. The third session will cover the positive approach and mindfulness, and we're also going to have a look at some exam technique. And then lastly, we are going to look at overall exam technique on the therapies. And we're also going to have a look at some example answers. As always, the chat function will be open, so if anybody has any questions, I can answer them at the end of this session. So for each approach that you look at, and there are 5 approaches overall, you need to study one type of therapy for each. Now, some of the therapies that I've decided to talk about within these sessions may not be the therapies that you've covered in your centres. And that's because the specification in the exam board sends us quite a big list, and each centre, each school or each college can actually choose which ones they want to teach you. So some of these may be really, really relevant, some of them not so much. But it's very, very clear to when you're looking at an exam question that you answer the right one and the one that you've been taught. So a therapy, which we will be talking about, is a form of treatment. So it's how they treat a mental illness or something that is causing somebody distress. And like I've said, your centre will have some options to choose from the specification. So therapy questions are usually your higher marked questions, 10, 12 marks. And that's why it's really, really important that we get this right, okay? Because it's very, very rare that there are marks over 12 marks in the exam. So therefore, we need to make sure that we're happy with this and that we can really achieve those full marks, because they will benefit us a lot when it comes to adding up the marks to give yourself a grade. So we really need to make sure that these therapy questions are really, really handy. You can be asked to describe a therapy, or you can be asked to evaluate a therapy. I'm going to go through the content that you would include in a describe question today, but evaluating the therapy is also really, really important, and something that hopefully we'll be able to cover in some of these sessions in the future. Having examples is really important in your essays, because they are your way of showing the examiner that you really understand what you're talking about and that you can back it up with something. So they're really important when gaining marks. And then appropriate terminology. At the top of every single mark band in psychology, it will say effective use of appropriate terminology. So it's making sure that you can identify the words that are really important to learn, and that you can learn them and remember them and embed them correctly in an essay question. So that's what we're going to look at in today's session, but also across the 4 sessions. Starting off then with the biological approach. So the biological approach to treating mental illness is drug therapy. And they believe that we can explain all behaviour by looking at our biological makeup, whether that be our neurotransmitters, genes, our brain and how the brain functions. And they also believe that if we have a problem with us that is biologically determined, then it needs to be treated in a biological way as well. So the approach believes that the mind should be treated in the same way as the body, and therefore physically. Therefore, drugs and psychosurgery are both used to alleviate these symptoms of mental illness. So I'm going to talk about drugs today, but psychosurgery is the other element to look at. All right, starting off then with the process of synaptic transmission. This is the process of how neurons and neurotransmitters, which are known as chemical messengers, how they move around your brain and how they tell you to behave or help you with your emotions. And something that we want to be able to stop is the process of reuptake. And I'm going to explain to you reuptake. So it's a really nice sort of entrance into an exam. So it says, reuptake refers to the process in the brain of neurons to retrieve chemicals that were not received by the next neuron. So in the image here, you've got your presynaptic neuron and your postsynaptic neuron. There are vesicles here, which are the circular bits, and then the black dots that we see in the middle, they are neurotransmitters. Now, what happens in somebody that is depressed or has a very, very low mood is that your neurotransmitters sort of congregate here around your presynaptic neuron, and they don't bind to the receptors here. They end up just kind of floating around, floating off up here. And so what happens is once they're here for a long time, they start to be reabsorbed back into this presynaptic neuron, which isn't what we want at all. We want it to flow through the brain so it can really make us feel happy. So what they need to do is they need to put a blockage essentially here. They need to block the reabsorption of serotonin. So this is what the drug does. These are your SSRIs, stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And the idea of this is that if serotonin isn't flowing through your brain and it's staying around here, then we need to block it from entering and therefore force it through the brain. And that's what an SSRI does. Now, neurotransmitters, there's quite a few neurotransmitters that it can be associated with. Depression is thought to be associated with quite low levels of a neurotransmitter, particularly noradrenaline, or known as norepinephrine, and serotonin. Most antidepressant drugs are therefore designed to prolong the effects of the neurotransmitter, so increase the amount of serotonin you have in your brain, or to stop the process of reuptake, which I've just explained to you, so that serotonin can flow through the brain and it does not get reabsorbed back up. So we want to increase the amount that is accumulated in that neuron and therefore available to release throughout the brain. So you've got two examples here: depression, which I've just spoken about, which is caused by lower levels of serotonin. That can be something naturally in your brain. Maybe your brain just doesn't really create that much serotonin and therefore needs a bit of help, or it could be something that could be triggered over time, or if you have gone through a traumatic event as well. Antidepressants, then, they are administered. That's our therapy, that's our drug, and they block the reuptake of serotonin so that the levels in the brain can increase. And then another example that you've got, and again, examples super important in gaining marks, is schizophrenia. So you can have increased levels of dopamine in the brain. That's what causes schizophrenia, too much dopamine. And therefore we need to try and dampen down the amount of dopamine in the brain. So we need to try and seize the neurotransmitters of dopamine and make sure that they are not as active. Okay, so those are two examples that you can use and bring into an essay here. All right, so getting into the main crux of what you would put in an essay is you need to know about 3 different types of drug: antipsychotics, antidepressants, and anti-anxiety drugs. If you are asked a 12-mark question, describe the main components of drug therapy, then you would have to include all 3 of these. Okay, so it's making sure you're able to explain them and that you're also able to provide an example as well. Starting off then with antidepressants, they are primarily used to treat depression. The clue is in the name, and many are also licensed for other conditions such as various forms of anxiety. Antidepressants, and a really good example here is Prozac. They alleviate or relieve the persistent low mood that somebody's experiencing, and they work by, like I said before, increasing serotonin in the brain. Now, they're known as SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and that blocks the reuptake of serotonin into the nerve cell and therefore prolongs the action, which is exactly what we want. We want as much serotonin in our brain for a prolonged amount of time. So the drugs are generally prescribed as a first choice for depression. So this is the first thing that you would be administered. If things don't work, then maybe they would try different drugs, and also they would pair drugs with CBT to see if they can also look at the root cause of the depressive episode. So that's your first example. And then you can back this up with a further example of Prozac. So like I said before, it's a reuptake inhibitor, which means that it stops the process of that serotonin being reuptaken, and it works by blocking the mechanism that transports serotonin into the presynaptic cell it has come from, so that more of it is able to cross that synapse and flow through the brain. So Prozac is something that would be really, really great to see in an essay question as an example of an antidepressant drug. And here is just another photo here. So these would be our serotonin, the little black dots, and this is your plug. And it's essentially blocking this hole to stop serotonin from staying around here, forcing it down to bind to the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, and that's our way of alleviating depression. Another drug that we can use is an antipsychotic drug. Now, they're also known as neuroleptics. Now, neuroleptic essentially just means that they are seizing the neurons, that they are stopping them or dampening down, or just lowering the activity of that neuron. So for this one, it's to do with schizophrenia. Okay, neuroleptics and antipsychotic drugs combat the symptoms by lowering dopamine activity. They have a proven effect on treating mania, and there are two different subtypes that you need to be aware of. So you have got your typical antipsychotic drugs, which work on dopamine alone. And then an example of that drug is chlorpromazine. And then the second generation is an atypical antipsychotic, which acts on serotonin and dopamine. So more neurotransmitters used, possibly could be a little bit stronger. But again, really, really important in decreasing serotonin, and the example used there is clozapine. So those are your antipsychotics examples. Something else to also include could be a stimulant drug. So you have got some examples here. So meth, as it is sort of quite colloquially known, improves mood, alertness and confidence, and they trigger the release of noradrenaline and dopamine in the brain. And they can also be used to treat narcolepsy and ADHD. So it's another example that you can bring in here. Okay, working then through to antipsychotic drugs. So an example here is Valium, and it works as a minor tranquilizer. A tranquilizer is something that calms you down, okay? It relaxes you. If you think about the word tranquil, if something's tranquil, it's very calm, it's very, very relaxed. And that's what Valium does. It is used for a short-term treatment of stress. And what it does is it slows down something called our sympathetic nervous system. So when we're quite stressed, when we're feeling quite anxious, our sympathetic nervous system kicks in and it is able to increase our heart rate, increase our breathing rate. It makes us sweat, it makes our muscles tense. It sort of has an impact on our digestive system, and that's why sometimes we can feel quite sick. And it's part of the fight or flight response. So what a Valium can do is slow down that and kind of start to kickstart our parasympathetic nervous system. Now, parasympathetic nervous system is something that is the opposite of what I've just said, really. It can slow down your heart rate, slow down your breathing rate. It can allow your muscles to relax. And those are your main symptoms of anxiety and stress. So really, really helpful in helping that disorder. An example of this one then is a beta blocker. So a beta blocker is something that can really, really reduce the activity of adrenaline. Now, adrenaline is a hormone that is released in fight or flight. And adrenaline is something that really gets our heart pumping. It makes us quite excited. It can really stimulate us. But in the fight or flight response, it can also cause a lot of anxiety and stress on a person. So a beta blocker is used to alleviate that, okay, and reduce the activity of adrenaline. The beta blockers bind to the receptor sites on the nerve cells of the heart and around your sympathetic nervous system, and therefore they can really calm you down. Okay, so there is a whistle-stop tour, really, of the biological explanation of therapy. And again, I just want to go through these top tips with you. The higher mark questions, they always are. Having an example, so using Prozac, Valium, beta blockers, using those key terms and those examples will really help you gain marks. And again, the terminology, so things like synaptic transmission, SSRI, they're really going to help showcase to the examiner your understanding of this. So there's the biological explanation. And now I'm going to move on and talk to you briefly about the psychodynamic explanation. So starting off with the unconscious mind, psychodynamic approach believes that human behaviour is largely influenced by unconscious drives and what is going on underneath the surface. Things that can't easily be accessed yet have a really, really big impact on our behaviour. So as you can see, the image at the bottom of the screen is a model used by Freud, where lots of things that we are consciously aware of are just the tip of the iceberg in the water, and there's so much going on underneath the surface that we're not consciously aware of. And Freud says it's those things under the surface that are represented in our dreams, things that we can't really think about or talk about consciously day to day are relegated, they're pushed into our dreams. And that's where sort of his theory starts. Okay, so let's have a look at our assumptions and how they apply to dream analysis. So starting off with our ego defense mechanisms. So your ego is that part of your personality that is the rational and part of the personality that sort of controls the demands of the id and the superego. It's your referee, it's your manager, it's the reality principle. And it has various different defense mechanisms that help it. Repression, regression, projection, and displacement. And those four are part of your assumptions. So the goal of the therapy is to make the unconscious more conscious. It's to make us understand that what's going on that we're not aware of, we need to be more aware of it, because it will help us understand why we may be feeling low or why we may develop a mental health illness. So what the therapist, or they're also known as a psychoanalyst, looks for is evidence of repression. Repression is that you've pushed something back. You've tried to forget about it. You don't want to think about it anymore. You don't want to have to experience it anymore. So you push it away and you get rid of it. And their aim is to decode the dream that you are having. Okay, so that's how your ego defense mechanism is linked to this. So applying the assumptions to dream analysis and the childhood experiences here is that traumatic childhood experiences that are buried in your unconscious may be causing you a lot of trouble in your adulthood, and therefore they may surface in your dreams as a way of working through a traumatic event. Now, we know that a lot of the psychodynamic approach and Freudian theory is based on things that happen to you in your childhood have an impact on you when you're older. And Freud says that if something has happened in your childhood, you may dream about it a lot, especially when you're older, just as a way of working through the event, understanding what's happened and try and get your head around really the event that's happened. So that's how the childhood experiences and those psychosexual stages of development are brought into dream analysis. And then lastly, you have got the tripartite personality. And this is the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, like I said previously, the ego is that manager, that referee part of our personality. The id, the devil on our shoulder, very childlike. And the id's demands could possibly be slightly too appropriate for waking hours. So Freud would say that lots of what happens in our dream is our id. It's that childlike, very sort of seeks immediate gratification part of our personality. And it's also linked to our impulses and our desires. Freud says that in order to safely think about those, that is why they are relegated to our dreams. And normally, in everyday conscious living, the ego would block them out and would referee it, but the ego goes to sleep when we go to sleep, and therefore the id is allowed to come to life. And then you've got this process of dream work, and latent content and manifest content are two really, really important key terms. The latent content of a dream is transformed into the manifest content. Now, latent content of a dream is the real meaning of the dream, and manifest content is the weird way that it's represented in your dreams. So for example, quite a common dream analysis is the feeling of being quite anxious. That would be the latent content, is represented in your dream by something happening to your teeth, whether that is them falling out or cracking or hurting in some way. That was how Freud would say that those two things are linked together. So latent and manifest content are really important key terms. Okay, also within this dream work process then, you have got condensation. So dreams are condensed into brief images, and one image can stand for several ideas. And then you've also got displacement. Emotional significance of one object is attached to an entirely new object. So these are different key terms that you can bring into an answer here. And they're all things that are represented in our dreams. And then you've also got representation, which is where a thought is translated into an image. And you've got symbolism. A symbol replaces an action, a person, or an idea. And then another really important one is secondary elaboration. And this is the idea that the unconscious mind collects lots of different images and lots of different things that have happened throughout our day, and then ties them together to form a logical story. So that may be that you dream about something you're worried about that's happening next week, but it's sort of confused with a film that you watched before you went to sleep, and a person that you've been thinking about, and an emotion that you feel, and they're all sort of bundled and tied up together. That would be secondary elaboration. And then you also have some further key components here. So there's lots and lots to this, and there's lots of key terms that you can use as well. Wish fulfillment. Freud believed that all dreams were the unconscious fulfillment wishes that could not be satisfied by our unconscious mind. That means that when we dream about, going to movie premieres with famous people, it's your way of your unconscious mind fulfilling that dream for you. It's probably not going to be something that you will do in waking life. I'm sorry to break that dream for you, and so therefore you will dream about it instead. So dreams as wish fulfillment. And then also this idea of a symbolic nature of dreams, which is what I spoke about before. The real meaning of the dream, which is known as latent content, is transformed into more innocuous form, and an innocuous meaning slightly weird, slightly strange, and not really what you would expect. So the dream may seem completely meaningless, but psychoanalysts are trained to interpret what they mean. So for example, Freud would suggest that dreaming about a gun or a snake may represent a penis, and dreaming of a tunnel or a cave may represent a vagina. Now that is very stereotypically Freudian in his thoughts, and there is limited proof, isn't there? There's limited objectivity here, which is something that you could definitely bring in with an evaluation question. So these are just some common dream interpretations that people have. So chase dreams, they are stemmed from feelings of anxiety. So if you're being chased or you're trying to run or outwit your pursuer, it's that you are feeling quite anxious in your conscious everyday life. Falling dreams are another really common one. They may indicate that you are contemplating giving in to a sexual urge or impulse, and you need to be quite discreet about it. Again, there is limited scientific objectivity to these therapies. They're very, very subjective. And then water dreams, so being splashed by water, maybe that your unconscious is telling you to wake up, get back in track with your life. And then boiling water may mean that your emotions are running high and that you need to relax and take your time with something that's going on in everyday life. And then we've also got the role of the therapist. So when you're working with a psychoanalyst and a therapist for this, they need to decode the dream. Okay, so say if you are feeling anxious and depressed, they need to say, right, what have you been dreaming about recently? What's going on in our unconscious mind? And they take that manifest content, that weirdness that the dream is telling you, and they turn it back into latent content, which is something that actually has a bit of meaning to your life. And what they do is they don't offer one explanation. Okay, they may say one thing, and the client or the patient may say, no, that doesn't really seem very relevant to my life. So therefore they will change it. Okay, and again, it questions the objectivity and the credibility of this therapy. But based on the patient's feedback and their knowledge of their life, they will change and offer multiple different explanations. All right, so again, that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the dream analysis content. Again, like I've said, it's making sure you've got this nailed, that you understand this, because it's worth a lot of marks. Having those examples in there will help you gain marks, and appropriate terminology, yet again, would be really, really helpful. Just a few revision tips of things that I would do if I were you, and a lot of things that I tell my students is start making a glossary of key terms. Okay, in order to get that terminology in the exam, I would make a list. Okay, so therapies at the top, all the key terms that come under therapy: synaptic transmission, SSRI, neuron, Valium, reuptake. Okay, and it's making sure that you're able to define those key terms that will really help you with the exam technique. And then again, for the psychodynamic approach, id, ego, superego, things like that. And then what I would maybe suggest is creating a mind map of information. Go back through your notes, then put all of your notes away, write down everything you know, and then check with your notes, and then write in a different colour things that you don't know. And it's having that distinction between what you do know and what you don't know that will sort of allow you to know what to spend more time on with your revision, instead of just going over things you know over and over again, which I know everybody is guilty of. So thank you very much for joining this session. I hope that that was useful to you. The next session, we are going to look at cognitive behavioural therapy and systematic desensitization from the cognitive and behaviourist approaches.